morning. You've had a lot of entertainment, so now we get to the really serious part. I'm not going to dance around at all. I'm much too old for that. So I'm going to stay right here. When I came up with the title for my talk, which is Realism is Not a Realistic Option, I wasn't sure what subject I'd focus on because there is no lack of impending catastrophes about which wise people assure us that the proposed solutions are all unrealistic. In regard to such seemingly intractable problems as climate change, global hunger, increasing economic inequality, and the like, those who propose solutions that are modest, likely achievable, and free of hubris toward the earth are inevitably denounced and derided as unrealistic, despite copious documentation that their proposals might well save us from the global disasters toward which we are plunging. What's realistic, we're told, is to fling ourselves onward, trusting in what we've been taught is progress, hoping that new and ever cleverer economic or technological fixes will make everything all right. Over and over again, official voices declaim that serious CO2 reduction is, quote, unrealistic because solar and wind are boutique industries, although the Union of Concerned Scientists has stated that renewable energy could reliably produce 80% of our electricity by 2050. And the number of people working in the solar industry, as I learned recently, is greater than the number of people working in coal. Small farmers are nice enough, we're told, but let's be realistic. They'll never feed the world, or even their own nations. So the percentage of global investment that was agriculture directed dropped from 16 to 4% between 1980 and 2010. Yet the 2013, just a couple of months ago, Trade and Environment Review from the United Nations Council on Trade and Development was called Wake Up Before It's Too Late, which is a pretty sexy title for a UN report, right? Calls for a major paradigm shift in agricultural development in both developed and developing countries. We need to move, they urge, from a green revolution to an ecological intensification approach, which, quote, implies a rapid and significant shift from conventional monoculture-based and high external input-dependent industrial production toward mosaics of sustainable regenerative production systems that also considerably improve the productivity of small-scale farmers. In other words, small-scale agriculture is what is going to feed the world if we give it a chance. So before I turn to my actual subject, which is soil, I'm going to begin with a very brief account of how I began my own long career of unrealism 36 years ago. Years before many of you were out of diapers, in 1977 to be exact, I was asked by the environmental organization Friends of the Earth to write a sort of manifesto about food, nutrition, and agriculture as a chapter for a book which was going to be called Progress as if Survival Mattered. We were already worrying about it, except we never did anything about it, right? This volume was to be placed on the desk of every incoming representative and senator on the first day of the next legislative session in the really naive hope that it might cause thinking in Congress. In regard to each topic covered, the assigned outline was, where are we now? Where do we have to be? And what do we have to do to get there? It was, of course, a completely unrealistic assignment, so I accepted it. After an orgy of reading and thinking, I concluded the following. Modern industrial agriculture was beginning to wreak havoc on U.S. air, soils, and waters, a fact not widely acknowledged. Worse, that same machinery and chemical-intensive, labor-saving, ecologically disastrous agricultural system was being exported around the world to where people needed not CAFOs, job-destroying machinery, and export crops, but small-scale animal raising, employment, and food crops, just as the recent UN report points out. My conclusion, the present global food system was environmentally unsustainable, and around the world, humans were destroying, mostly unknowingly, the basis of their own survival. As for the second question, where did we need to get to? The answer seemed evident. Given the inherently localized nature of the ecologies of the natural systems on which we all depended, we obviously needed to end up in a world composed of much smaller, much more regionally self-sustaining and self-restraining units, each of which would recognize the ecological limits of its own region. Where food was concerned, this meant we needed to invest in food production systems around the world that were based on and respected their local environments. Since what we called progress was carrying us inexorably toward larger global systems, I couldn't imagine how such a world would ever come about, if at all. And if it seemed so unlikely to me and I had confronted the alternatives, how would the scenario be made credible for anyone else? Which led me to the third question: how could we get to where we had to go? I'm an educator, and it seemed to me the only way we might begin to turn things around was to teach people to pay attention to the ongoing global costs of the production and transportation of their food. And how could ordinary citizens be made to pay any attention? They didn't know anything about farming. Only by learning how food was produced, I thought, and that is, they had to get to know a farmer close up. And how could they do that if the only farmers left were nameless bodies growing our fruits and vegetables on vast California landscapes, or riding tractors across the Midwest to produce endless acres of wheat, corn, and soybeans for food processors and livestock raisers? So I arrived at what then seemed a totally unrealistic solution. We had to eat more locally. This was 1977, remember, to keep local farmers in business so we could get to know what they did and learn to understand and appreciate the environmental consequences of farming. Now remember, this was 1977. And after I said something in a public setting about local eating, I learned what unrealistic really meant. Nobody will do that, people said. That's stupid. Progress has meant eating whatever you want at whatever time of year. Why on earth would any American give that up? Even more challenging, however, was the next question, because I lived in the Northeast, and the next question was, so what would you eat in winter? And that question set me off on what became a very long journey, because frankly, as a native Californian, I didn't have a clue. Seasonal food, this was a theoretical construct. That's what we academics do. You know, we reach theoretical conclusions, but unfortunately, I'm one of those people who believes you have to live by what you say. So, there were no seasonal foods identified in the markets those days, and I couldn't buy locally because most major farms didn't produce. There was nothing produced in my area that I could buy. So I had to grow my own just to see what was possible, which is why for many years now I've been doing just that. And I haven't yet dug the sweet potatoes this year, so I hope I get home in time to do it. And the rest is history. I'm still alive, making my way through increasingly old age, and I haven't bought a vegetable in years. Which I recognize is no help to my local farmers, but I'm sorry, I'm addicted to my own food. And if I wanted to, I actually could buy locally now because local food is now trendy, almost a fad, alas. Farmers markets are multiplying, and young people graduating from Yale are saying to their heavily indebted parents at graduation, I might want to be a farmer. Which brings me quite naturally to soil, the topic of my remaining, how many minutes? 9 minutes? I thought I had 9 minutes. I don't know what I have. I'll just go on till I'm finished. Although I've been seriously food gardening for over 50 years and thought I was a knowledgeable friend of the soil, I was until recently stunningly naive about the lives being lived under my feet. Of course I knew, as many people do, that there are millions of organisms in the soil, most of them too small to be noticed. But a Christmas present, Cornell professor David Wolf's Tales from the Underground, changed my whole view of the world down there. Push your thumb and index finger into the root zone of a patch of grass and bring up a pinch of earth. You will likely be holding close to 1 billion individual living organisms. Perhaps 10,000 distinct species of microbes, he writes, most of them not yet named, cataloged, or understood. Interwoven with the thousands of wispy root hairs of the grass would be coils of microscopic gossamer-like threads of fungal hyphae, the total length of which would be measured in miles, not inches. That's a billion living organisms, 10,000 species of microbes, and miles of fungal threads, most of them not yet named, cataloged, or understood, in just a pinch of earth. We know more about the movement of celestial bodies than we do about the soil, Wolf adds, at least partly because it's nearly impossible to study these organisms in the laboratory. Scientists are lucky, he says, if they can come up with the right nutrient mix to culture and study 1% of the microbes found in a typical soil sample. This poor success rate is due in part to the complex interdependence between subterranean organisms. They can't survive when separated from their neighbors, which is something we have yet to learn, right? So that's what's in our dirt. Billions of interdependent organisms about which we still know, more than a decade into the 20th century, almost nothing. Now, less than 20 years ago, we introduced into this vast sea of ignorance a new technology called genetic engineering that was rapidly adopted in the US for use on major commodity crops. Genetically engineered plants, most of them designed to be invulnerable to the glyphosate-based herbicide Roundup, now occupy 93% of US soybean acreage and 73% of US corn acreage, the most rapid adoption of a new technology that has ever happened. So a hell of a lot of our topsoil gets sprayed every year with Roundup. It is widely known among agriculturists that glyphosate binds soil minerals, making them less available to plants. But little attention has been paid to this, beyond recommending that farmers increase the manganese in their fertilizer applications to compensate for glyphosate-induced manganese shortages. Then 2 years ago, the Department of Agriculture was asked to approve planting a Roundup-ready version of alfalfa, our major animal feed crop. In January of 2011, before the decision was made, a noted crop scientist, Emeritus Professor Don Huber of Purdue University, wrote to USDA Secretary Vilsack describing a series of disturbing problems apparently related to glyphosate and urging that the alfalfa release be postponed to allow for more research. The identified problems included infertility and early-term abortions in cattle. And as you know, if cattle can't reproduce, we don't have any milk. And hogs also were affected, who were fed GM corn and soy were affected the same way. A loss of the next generation of animals that was putting some dairy farmers out of business. Researchers in the field were also noticing a rise in harmful fungi and parasites, while beneficial fungi and other organisms that help plants utilize minerals were declining. These are some of the organisms I was talking about before. Professor Huber warned that a new pathogen apparently related to the use of glyphosate seemed to be affecting the health of plants in the field and animals fed those plants. And he asked the Agriculture Secretary to slow down the approval of Roundup-ready alfalfa to allow time for careful study of the pathogen and its effects. The letter was sent confidentially to the Secretary. It was leaked, probably by the Secretary's staff, and within a month, Vilsack approved the unrestricted planting of GE alfalfa. Once Professor Huber's observations were circulated on the blogosphere, there was major pushback. Denunciations, denials, criticisms from scientists about Huber's claimed failure to provide detailed studies, and so on. Although a few other scientists, defying a flood of hostile attacks and near retirement, which is the only time you dare to criticize GM, were reporting problems with crops and animals exposed to Roundup. At this point, the din of denial is so noisy that it's impossible to sort out exactly how much of what Huber has reported is accurate. Though what is beyond dispute is that any researcher who reports a negative finding about a genetically engineered crop will be viciously attacked. So it's very hard for people, ordinary people, flooded with the disinformation that comes from the major corporations, to sort out what's really true simply because they won't let the research be done. Meanwhile, the USDA has decided to allow a glyphosate-resistant form of the nation's most important forage crop to be planted on millions of acres, thus exposing even more soil organisms to the already used glyphosate. And as little as we know about the organisms down there that are getting hit, what's certain is that when you kill off some organisms, others will move in their place. That's how nature works. Now let me go on to a personal story about my beloved food-producing garden on the west bank of the Hudson that was utterly destroyed by the Hudson River in 2010. Rebuilt to be 2 feet higher so the land would at least drain, because until then my planting area was a bathtub, most of the garden ended up with some topsoil, except for 4 beds filled to the top with subsoil, so rock hard that when a friend came by with a pickaxe to break some of them up, we tossed the surface lumps into the river because they were too unyielding to smash. I knew how to turn this stuff into fertile soil over time, but I wanted to use the bed immediately and tried to imagine what might agree to grow there. Ultimately, I decided to plant sweet potatoes in 1 bed, my experience being that sweet potatoes would grow anywhere and at least cover the bed with pretty foliage. So in mid-June, I planted 12 sweet potato slips sprouted from one of last year's crop. As expected, the bed produced mountains of beautiful foliage, and in October, a friend and I dug in to see what had developed underground. I had a remarkably good crop, 23 pounds of sweets from a 3 by 12 foot space, but more remarkable was what the roots had done to the soil. In 1 growing season, the sweet potatoes had converted a bed of silt that had hardened into rock when you looked at it into a crumbly soil you could push your hand into. Concluding after a web search, I was so stunned by it that I kept going at every morning and sticking my hand in. I couldn't believe it had happened. Concluding after a web search that this beneficial sweet potato effect was not common knowledge, I asked around until I reached a farmer who was also a microbiologist trained in Europe. The first person I talked to who was unsurprised. He's told me that certain soil fungi collect sugar drops given off by the root hairs of big-rooted crops and secrete a compound called glomalin that glues together the soil particles, preventing them from packing into a rock-like mass. Here's part of the text of a pamphlet he sent me called What is Glomalin from the USDA. Glomalin was identified at USDA in the early 1990s on hair-like projections of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These fungi are ancient microorganisms that evolved with plants to aid in acquiring nutrients, especially immobile nutrients like phosphorus. So now we know. Here's an ancient vital organism absolutely critical to the texture, the phosphorus availability, and therefore the production capacity of our soils. As the pamphlet on glomalin says, it's literally holding our farms together. Yet, as another of my soil books reports, glomalin was considered an unidentified contaminant of humus until 1996. So until 17 years ago, we farmed in total ignorance of these absolutely essential organisms. Obviously, we're growing our food cluelessly, as if nature were an enemy with whom we are at war, drenching our soils with chemical novelties to kill organisms we have decided are our foes, unconcerned about the fate of our unknown friends. Year after year, we've been dumping a single chemical, glyphosate, on literally millions of acres, assuming it would do only what we intended, kill weeds. We don't need Professor Hubris' assertions to know that glyphosate is changing the invisible lives in the soil, and that those underground organisms, most of us are hardly aware of, may be more vital to our food production and hence our long-term survival as a species than any of the larger living things we encounter every day, whether plant or animal. And so it's evident that where soil is concerned, realism is no longer an option. Actual reality is. We cannot go on treating soil like dirt and expect to survive. Or in the words of Richard Feynman, that wonderful man who discovered why the shuttle broke down, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Unrealistic as it is to imagine the planet's 7 billion people taking a stand on behalf of the organisms under their feet, that ultimately seems much more likely than just going on as we are. Thank you.